Outsourcing, business and national security writer Tim Shorrock explores the privatization of U.S. intelligence. Mr. Shorrock contends that 70% of the U.S. intelligence budget is outsourced. The event, hosted by the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., is 75 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming out today for this event sponsored by Foreign Policy in Focus. We are a project of the Institute for Policy Studies here in Washington, D.C. We're a network of over 700 scholars, activists, journalists who take a critical look at U.S. foreign policy. You can find us at the web at www.foreignpolicyinfocus.org. My name is John Pfeffer. I'm the co-director of Foreign Policy in Focus, along with Mira Woods here at the Institute for Policy Studies. And we are delighted to have Tim Shorrock here. Tim is contributor to Foreign Policy in Focus, and I've known Tim for more than a decade now. And some of you might be familiar with his work on Korea, which is how I came to know Tim. Tim is the best kind of journalist. He pursues doggedly the truth, and his work on Korea exemplified that work. His work on exposing U.S. connections to the Gwangju uprising, the South Korean government's putting down of that uprising in South Korea in 1980, was groundbreaking. And it was tremendous when Tim started to look in the last decade at the Iraq War and digging out information about U.S. complicity in the Iraq War. And when all the other journalists were acting as lapdogs, Tim was a bulldog. And it was, I'm sure, a bad sign for the intelligence community when Tim Shorrock decided he was going to look at that issue, the privatization and outsourcing of intelligence here in the United States. His new book, Spies for Hire, is, as he says, the first nonfiction book about outsourcing. There's a novel out there on this topic, but this is the first nonfiction book, and we're delighted to have him here. I'll speak for about a half an hour, then we'll take some questions and answers from you. Take it away, Tim.
Okay, thank you, John. I want to correct one thing. Not all journalists were lapdogs, and in fact, there's one in the room who's one of the best journalists in the country on intelligence, so thank you for being here. There's a lot of people in the press that have really been focused on U.S. intelligence and have done an excellent job of uncovering issues that's very important to the public. I want to say it's really nice to be back here at IPS. The last time I spoke here was when I was sort of a featured speaker, was in the mid-'80s, and I was speaking on Korea, actually, at the time. And there was a guy in the audience who was a very clean-cut guy, blonde hair, and I thought, well, this guy must be from the Heritage Foundation or something. He was paying very close attention. He looked very, very straight, very, well-dressed, and kind of out of step with most of the people at IPS. Anyway, he came up to me later. It turned out he was a Soviet diplomat, and it turned out he was assigned to the Soviet embassy to study Asia policy. And a couple years later, there was an expulsion of CIA agents from Moscow, and the U.S. retaliated by expelling a bunch of KGB people from Washington, and my friend Igor turned out to be KGB. So you never know who you meet. You never know who you meet at IPS, and maybe there's somebody sitting here from an interesting country or organization like that. Anyway, like John said, I've written this book, and it's been a few years in the making. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I got interested in this subject of intelligence and outsourcing of intelligence. And then I'm going to actually read a little bit from my book and to give you a little flavor of what's in there and some of the key issues I bring up. And then open it up for questions and answers, which is, to me, the most interesting parts of events like this. Anyway, like John also said, I'd been a journalist for a long time. I worked for over 15 years in the business press, and I worked for a long time for a newspaper called the Journal of Commerce, which covered trade, global trade and transportation. And especially when I was writing there, I've always been fascinated by the interplay between business/capitalism and foreign policy and national security, and sort of, you know, how they work together, and how corporations basically made money out of national security. Not so much the lobbying part, but kind of how they work behind the scenes and create these organizations to further their policies, particularly in certain countries. When I was working at the Journal of Commerce, I got really interested in these organizations that have these vague names like United States Indonesia Society, and it sounds like a sort of cultural organization, but and actually, you know, you look at them and who runs them, oftentimes it's, you know, former high-ranking diplomats, former high-ranking intelligence officials, and they create these organizations to further, you know, American policy into their way, of course, in places like Indonesia, and often in places where the governments are authoritarian and they want to sort of improve the image of the government. So there's this kind of, it's not lobbying, it's just kind of, you know, behind the scenes maneuvering, you might say, to push certain kinds of policies. And in the early days of this current Bush administration, I did a lot of reporting. I wrote one of the first in-depth pieces about the Carlyle Group, the private equity fund that was where at that time George Bush Sr. was a senior advisor, and James Baker III, people like that. And I looked at how they were drawing on their own experience and their own and all their contacts to make investment decisions, in particularly in defense. And this was at a time when, you know, like they made very clever decisions on selling some of their operations at particular times, like just after 9/11, they did a IPO. They sold the stock in this one company called United Defense that made the Bradley fighting vehicle, and it's perfectly timed for the war that Bush's son was about to start. And they were also pretty invested in intelligence. So I was following this sort of phenomenon, and then came Abu Ghraib and the prison abuse scandal there, and as was reported by Seymour Hersh and others, there were two companies involved in Abu Ghraib, and one of them was a company called CACI, which is also known as Khaki International. And it just struck me as, well, first of all, and these companies were, according to military reports, were deeply involved in some of the worst abuse, like Khaki, for example. One or two of their people had been, and this is according to later trials of people that were lower-level people that were put on trial and convicted. There was testimony at their trials that Khaki personnel had brought in some of the and encouraged some of the worst practices at this prison, and one of them was introducing, you know, dogs, these attack dogs, to frighten and basically terrorize these prisoners. And it struck me as outrageous that we had, you know, this was like, you know, interrogation could be like a profit center for companies, and why are we hiring these private entities to do this kind of very sensitive work that really, I mean, we saw in Abu Ghraib how much it damaged the nation's, you know, the perceptions of the United States overseas, and we've probably, you know, it's kind of going to take a couple decades to recover from that. But I began to ask, like, why are intelligence companies so involved here in this kind of thing? And I also began looking at some of the key people that this one particular company, Khaki, had on its board, and they were advisors. And for example, like Richard Armitage, who used to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense, he had been on the board of Khaki, and I kept finding these people like that, former high-ranking officials who would go to these companies. And so I finally, about, for when was it, 2005, I think it was, I did a story for Mother Jones magazine that looked at sort of, you know, just this phenomenon of intelligence outsourcing and who was involved and how large it was. And at the time, my conclusion was, based on interviewing a lot of people here in D.C., was that is about, I estimated at the time that about 50% of the budget was being spent on contractors. And it turned out to be well, quite a low estimate because when I was doing this book, and I was hoping to get some figures from the government and from the intelligence services, intelligence community about how much was outsourced. It was really the agencies basically wouldn't talk to me, and especially the bigger ones, and they consider it a national security secret, how much contractors they have, even though they have many contractors there. But anyway, about a year ago, I was able to obtain a unclassified slideshow that was put on at a Defense Intelligence Agency conference. And one of the slides in this thing, I almost literally fell off my chair when I saw it, because it was a big pie chart. And the pie chart had a circle, and there was like 70% and 30%, and the 70% said contracts, private contracts. And so when I checked up on this, and actually the Office of Director of National Intelligence had produced this slide, and I called their press office, and I finally got someone to talk to me there, and they said, yeah, it's true, it's 70%, but this covers everything from pencils to satellites, and they hemmed and hawed, but they still wouldn't give me any dollar figures. But sometimes when you get PowerPoint slides, you can click, your right clicker on your mouse, and up jumped a bunch of underlying figures in this pie chart. And so it gave actually, numbers of how much intelligence spending had been over the last few years, and it was astounding. At the time, I think this was a year ago, and the figures were about, end of 2006, and it was something like $43 billion were being spent then on intelligence contracts, and I think it's gone up since then. So I give in the book, I give a figure of about $50 billion. That's what I estimate the industry to be. And it's a hard industry to focus on as an industry in itself, because here in Washington, nobody really covers the intelligence industry specifically as an industry. You have to look at, like, Washington Technology, which is a publication of the Washington Post, covers information technology companies. So, like, a lot of the intelligence contractors are IT companies, and they contract with the government. So a lot of the leading IT companies are also leading intelligence companies. So you'll look at the IT list, the top 100 they put out every year. They just put out one in Washington Technology about a week ago or so. You'll see, Booz Allen Hamilton, Science Applications International Corporation, Lockheed Martin. These kind of companies are the big IT companies. They're also the really big intelligence companies. And then, of course, if you look at the top 100 defense contractors, the same thing. So you can sort of see who the top defense and the top IT companies are, and that's generally who the top intelligence contractors are. Of course, the difficulty in tracking the industry is that something like maybe it's 80%, 75 to 80% of intelligence contracts are classified, they're secret, often top secret. So it's pretty difficult to actually, get hold of the contracts, or get hold of the, even the aggregate figures for contracts. And people often won't talk about any specific contract. The only way you can read, they announce them, but it's often very kind of vague language. Like, the company will say, we just received $130 million to help fight the war on terror. They don't tell you if it's NSA or CIA or whoever it is. But at any rate, it's difficult to track. But as you see in the book, there's lots of opportunity, because so many of these companies are publicly traded companies. You can buy and sell their shares on the stock market. So they all have to file with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They all have to file fairly detailed reports, like any company must. And when there's a material change in their situation, they all, like, if they get a big contract or they lose a big contract, they have to report that to the SEC. So you can follow a lot of what they do, and sometimes annual reports are pretty detailed about what they do. And I got a lot of information out of some annual reports of certain companies, and they'll even go into some detail about specific agencies that they work for and what they specifically what they do. Often it's jargon you have to kind of cut through and understand what they're talking about, but the information's out there. So in a sense, the more it becomes a private sector business, the more you can actually learn about intelligence. It's kind of a window. It's a sort of a window into the intelligence community and what they're doing. So just to kind of give you a flavor, I just wanted to read from the prologue of my book, where a lot of the reporting I did was there used to be a conference here in Washington called IntelCon. I think it was only held twice, but it was sort of an open source conference on intelligence, and there was a lot of interesting speakers. And I picked up a lot of information, met a lot of people there. And I also have gone to quite a few industry symposia, and also these symposiums, they have exhibits where you can, companies have on display what the software that they make and that kind of thing. So there are opportunities, unclassified places you can go and learn a lot about it. So if you bear with me a little bit, I just want to read a little bit from my prologue. On May 9th, 2006, John Humphrey, a former CIA officer making his way up the management ladder of one of the nation's largest intelligence contractors, made a stunning disclosure to IntelCon, a national intelligence conference and exhibition in Bethesda, Maryland. Outsourcing, Humphrey declared, was out of control. Contractors deployed in Iraq and other hotspots overseas were making decisions and handling documents that in earlier times had been the sole responsibility of U.S. military and intelligence officers. This had caused a, quote, paradigm shift, unquote, in the relationship between government and the private sector, and left companies like his in an untenable position. 5 years ago, you'd never have a contractor supporting an operation on the field where they're making a recommendation to an officer, said Humphrey, nor would you find a contractor making little contributions here and there in the reports intelligence officers sent back to Washington. This concerns me a lot, the way these lines are blurring, he went on. We shouldn't be involved in some of these intelligence operations or the planning or the interrogations and what have you. Unless government started taking more responsibility in the field, he warned, the blowback for the contracting industry could be profound. The intelligence professionals in the room looked stunned. They had just sat through 2 days of upbeat discussions about the annual $10 billion expansion of U.S. intelligence budgets and the opportunities that money presented for defense contractors, information technology vendors, and former national security officials who still held their top secret security clearances. Upstairs in the exhibition hall, 35 companies were displaying the latest high-tech spying equipment and competing to recruit new employees who could earn up to 3 times government pay by migrating to the private sector. Words like blowback did not come easily at such gatherings. But this speaker and the corporation he represented had an exceptional story to tell. Humphrey was employed by Khaki International, Inc., a $1.8 billion information technology company that does more than 70% of its business with the Department of Defense. For many years, Khaki had been one of the Pentagon's favorite contractors. It was particularly respected for its professional evaluations of software and IT products supplied to the military by outside vendors. During the late 90s, Khaki moved heavily into military intelligence when the Pentagon, its budget reduced by nearly 30% from the days of the Cold War, and unhappy with the quality of intelligence it was getting from the CIA, began bringing in private sector analysts for the first time. This proved to be a prescient move for Khaki when 19 Muslim fanatics linked to al-Qaeda steered 3 hijacked jetliners into the World Trade Center in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. In the aftermath of the worst terrorist attack in American history, The intelligence community began scouring Washington for analysts, covert operatives, translators, and interrogators it could deploy in the hunt for their perpetrators, and to fill the ranks of the hastily organized counterintelligence centers at the Central Intelligence Agency and other government agencies. CACI, which already had a small army of trained and cleared intelligence specialists holding security clearances, was perfectly positioned to pick up the slack. Between 2002 and 2006, CACI signed dozens of new contracts, acquired 12 companies, and more than tripled its revenue from $564 million a year to nearly $2 billion a year. Its astonishing growth catapulted the company from a bit role in IT to one of the key players in what has become a $50 billion a year intelligence industrial complex. Quote, CACI is a cash flow story, Dave Graggetz, CACI's chief operating officer, boasted to investors in 2006. Whenever you hear bad news, it's usually good news for us. And I talk a little bit in the next paragraph how they got CACI got this contract in Abu Ghraib by buying another company that had a contract with the Pentagon. And then I say that tasked with the job of rooting out the leaders of the insurgency, some CACI employees directed military interrogators to use techniques on Iraqi prisoners that were, to put it mildly, far outside the norm of civilized conduct. Reports of the mistreatment soon made their way to U.S. commanders in Iraq, who appointed an Army general to investigate conditions of the prisoner. And then this report came out thrusting the Bush administration into one of its most serious foreign policy crises. And the details of a lot of what happened there you can read about in Seymour Hersh's great book, Chain of Command. And there was also a film distributed last year, you may have seen, it was distributed on DVD only, I think, by Robert Greenwald, called Iraq for Sale, The War Profiteers. He had a section on CACI. And I say how, you know, the reports focused on some of the most brutal practices, and they talked about CACI's role, particularly in this use of attack dogs. But the problem was, the pictures themselves of those attack dogs convinced U.S. military tribunals to convict 2 of the dog handlers for assault. No case was ever made against CACI's people, however, even though one of CACI's employees, a former prison guard named Steven Stefanowicz, was identified at trial as suggesting the use of the dogs. He has never been charged with a crime, and nor has CACI itself. Instead, the CEO of CACI went after anybody who wrote about it, and in his opinion distorted the story, and he fought back with a vengeance, attacking journalists who printed stories about the scandal, generally castigating anyone who dared to suggest that CACI bore any responsibility for the abuse. And CACI has just put out a little book about their terrible ordeal with this situation. They're still at it, trying to correct the story as they see it. And I'm sort of waiting for the legal foot to drop from them, because they seem to like to sue everybody that writes about them. But then I talk about how, despite what's happened there, they've gotten huge amounts of contracts from the Department of Defense since then. And in fact, about 3 weeks ago, they were part of a very large set of contracts awarded by the Defense Intelligence Agency to 8 different companies to provide intelligence analysis to the DIA. But the important part, getting back to this person from CACI who spoke, in his remarks, John Humphrey, this CACI person, who had also worked before he went to the company as a CIA agent, was careful not to accept or even apportion any blame for what happened. The individuals involved in the Abu Ghraib incidents, as he called them, had the best intentions. A contractor at an internment camp is in a very stressful situation, he said. You're being told you have to do this, that you're the only one who can do this. Contractors, he concluded, need to settle back to being in a supportive role. Inside the government, there's a little too much right now of let's get a contractor and life is good. There needs to be more of a setting of a line. To date, his speech is the most detailed and honest analysis of Abu Ghraib to come from CACI. And I conclude this part of it by saying that what happened there and Kaki's refusal to discuss what happened at Abu Ghraib stands as a kind of high water mark for intelligence contracting. In 2006, the year Humphrey delivered his comments, the cost of America's spying and surveillance activities outsourced to contractors reached $42 billion, or about 70% of the estimated $60 billion the government spends every year on foreign and domestic intelligence. Unfortunately, we cannot know the true extent of outsourcing for two reasons. First, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence refused to release an internal report on contracting out of fear that its disclosure would harm national security interests. And second, most intelligence contracts are classified, allowing companies like Kaki to hide their activities behind a veil of secrecy. And that's how I begin it. And in the book, I go through pretty much all the key agencies and what they do, including the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, talk about the key companies that work for them. The latter part of my book, the last couple of chapters, are about the NSA and the implications of corporations being involved in surveillance by the National Security Agency. This is something that as a citizen, I feel particularly alarmed about because, you know, we know a lot about the telecom companies cooperating with the NSA and being, you know, basically giving access to their databases to the NSA and allowing the NSA to search through, you know, millions of telephone calls, records of telephone calls. And we also know from testimony from ATT technicians that the NSA basically built a pipeline to the ATT's internet system in San Francisco and other cities, St. Louis as well, where they just, you know, copied everything coming in on the internet. So they, you know, they have a lot they've been analyzing, but that the telecom companies gave them access to this, and now there's still a big fight in Congress of whether they should be given immunity about if they broke any laws. But I make this argument in here that there's all these companies, dozens of companies like Kaki International, Mantech International, SAIC, Booz Allen, that provide the analysis, that actually scrutinize telephone calls for, you know, clues supposedly to what a terrorist group might be doing, and trying to basically essentially what they're doing is trying to track pre-crime, like that Tom Cruise movie. But you have this huge you know, group of companies that are deeply involved in analyzing this kind of intelligence. And I think, you know, if we're talking about telecom responsibility in terms of what may have been illegal, warrantless surveillance of Americans, those companies are also have some questions to answer, I believe, and we need to look at them as well. And that whole industry, I think, is very important to broaden it out from the telecoms to all these IT companies. And finally, the other issue that is part of that is the whole issue of domestic surveillance and how it's being, and how NSA and other agencies that in the past always spied on foreign countries, that was always designed to, you know, track, you know, the conversations of Soviet leaders and stuff like that. And now we're using these, the government is using these agencies to try to find evidence and to track domestic evildoers, or potential evildoers, as Bush calls them. And I have a story today running in Salon about a Saudi Arabian charity that they had a relationship with a Islamic charity in Oregon, and of course the NSA spied on, tracked the telephone calls, and accidentally gave the document to someone here in the room who's the lawyer for the charity. And this was a little problem for them because it opened the door for a major lawsuit against the NSA by this charity. But what really troubles me, and what I wrote about in this article, was how they used the NSA and whatever other surveillance they picked up to call this group and certain individuals in Oregon terrorists. They have a term called specially designated global terrorists, and people like that, they can't see the evidence, they can't see the classified evidence, they have no way to challenge the evidence. There's not one single evidentiary hearing where they can challenge it, and it's this very murky system where I think our justice system has been turned on its head. And as I've been doing the reporting on that particular story, I've actually identified several companies. One I found the other day when I was looking through some of the Treasury Department material on it, a contractor called EG&G that they contracted out some of the analysis to. But there's a couple other companies I've identified. So anytime we're talking about foreign intelligence, domestic intelligence, we have to we have to understand that there's many companies involved in this too. And when we say that 70% of the budget goes to these private companies, that means a huge proportion of our intelligence work is being handled for profit by the private sector. And this raises, to me, a whole lot of issues, including civil liberties issues, that are very important for us at this time. So I'm going to stop there and take questions, and hope to hear some interesting ones. David, go ahead.
One of the interesting aspects of outsourcing or privatization, and you see this in the debate over private military and security contractors, is that supposedly there's a bright shining line. What people on the government side say, this is inherently governmental, therefore the private sector should never do it. It should be reserved for the public sector. Now, admittedly, that's a pretty flexible line, but in the aftermath of Abu Ghraib, which you cite, at least for a while, they said, okay, we belatedly come to the recognition this is an inherently governmental task. We should not have firms like CACI or even to some lesser extent Titan doing translation, do this kind of work, and undersecretaries of defense for intelligence, went back and say, yeah, and we even put out a memo on this years ago, etc. But one gets a sense when one looks at intelligence contracting that they threw that concept out the window. I mean, where, if anywhere, and I'm just asking because I truly want to know, in the intelligence community, what is the function within all the things that the intelligence community does, where they say, this is inherently governmental, we can't allow private contractors to do this. And as a follow-up to that, when an intelligence contractor does a task, whatever it is, what does government do to ensure that what they're getting is actually worthwhile? In other words, what kind of quality control do they do it? Even with private military and security contractors, sporadic as oversight occasionally is, at least occasionally you get reports coming out of Special Inspector General for ROCs, CBO, GAO, DOD IG, etc. If the CIA IG puts out a report, we in the public never see it. So those two points are inherently governmental, and where's the quality control?
Good questions. And to the first issue of inherently governmental, I quote in here from a report from the House Intelligence Committee last year when they were drawing up the budget bill for the intelligence community, which it was never passed, and it was vetoed eventually by President Bush. Nevertheless, the language is in there, and in the report accompanying that legislation, the House Intelligence Committee said, the government has no standards at all on what's inherently governmental and what is not. They haven't even sat, 7 years or 10 years after all this outsourcing, nobody's within government has gone and said, okay, what of these tasks should just be left to our people, to the government, and what's okay to outsource? They haven't done that at all. And I think that's a pretty sad commentary that discussion has apparently not even occurred within our government. As far as oversight goes, I think the oversight of intelligence is not the best it could be. I think it's pretty loose anyway, and I think there's a lot of things that happen that Congress that should be looking at that they're not. But when it comes to contracting, there's even a lot. I mean, it's even harder because they don't even know. Admiral McConnell, who's now the Director of National Intelligence, when he was up for his nomination hearing in was it February '07. Somebody asked him was asking him a little bit about contracting, and And the senator who was asking him said, you know, we here in the Senate, we have no idea how much outsourcing is going on. They don't have any figures. And so I don't really understand how they can possibly do their job without knowing exactly who's doing what, you know, what agencies, what percentage they contract out. So, you know, I think in terms of reporting this story, the Office of Director of National Intelligence wouldn't really give me anything. The NSA wouldn't talk to me. CIA finally let someone talk to me, but they wouldn't identify him by name. It's just some generic spokesperson, and he wouldn't give me any figures. There's only a few agencies that will say how much, and like one of them is, to their credit, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which provides intelligence for the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense. They say that 35% of their workforce is contracted. So at least they give you the straight figure. And the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which provides imagery and mapping for military and intelligence agencies, they told me also that their workforce is 50% contractors. There's another agency that's highly secretive called the National Reconnaissance Office, which manages military satellites, and they're 95% contractors. So basically, you know, the workforce is it's a huge private sector workforce. And in terms of oversight, I think there's some real issues with, you know, like for example, there's this story about the NSA, National Security Agency. There's a project called Trailblazer where they hired a company called SAIC, a very large defense contractor, to manage a project which was, to put it very simply, was basically to try to draw electronic intelligence from all the cell phones and, you know, internet that grew up after the late 1990s. That project was ran into huge cost overruns, $4 or $5 billion they spent, and basically it turned out a bunch of junk and was useless. And then the same company got the contract for the follow-up project. So you sort of wonder about things like that in terms of oversight. Doug.
Yeah, great talk. So Doug Brooks, International Peace Operations Association. I think you raised some really key issues. I guess my point would be, okay, if you look at the big intelligence failures, 9/11, the Iraq War, the sort of weapons of mass destruction, and so on, clearly something needed to be done to improve intelligence, and I don't think the government's ever allowed to fire anyone, even if they, you know, have these failures. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me bringing the sort of cost effectiveness and value from the private sector makes a lot of sense. Now, I think your key points are really good. I mean, you got to make sure the rules are there, that the oversight's there. But essentially bringing that kind of efficiency does make some sort of sense, or why does the government actually outsource it all? I mean, what's their reasoning on it?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, I think that what happened, and it was even, you know, the outsourcing began long before 9/11, and there's quite a bit of it in the late 1990s. But I mean, essentially, you know, in the early 1990s, there was pretty big cuts to the defense budget and the intelligence budget, part of the so-called peace dividend. And staffs at some of these places, like the NSA, were cut like 30%. CIA was cut. A lot of people left. Some of them went into the private sector, and so clearly the intelligence community became smaller than it was, and for a while that was no problem. But when in the second half of the Clinton administration, when the Clinton got involved in the NATO wars in Yugoslavia, and there was a sudden need for intelligence analysts and all kinds of intelligence that they needed. The people in the government simply weren't there because the budgets had been cut, and so a lot of the institutional memory, in a sense, was in the private sector. So they went to the private sector and started hiring people. And then, of course, 9/11, there was this just like, enormous amounts of money were thrown at the intelligence budget, and budgets increased, 30%, 40% a year for a few years there. And, you had the same problem. I think the issue is we as a nation and our Congress really needs to figure out and think what kinds of functions are okay to give to private companies. Obviously, the government's not going to have a factory to make, U-2s or something like that. I mean, private sector companies can provide a lot of that kind of technology. But in terms of the analysis, writing the reports that go upstream to high-level people, like the president's daily brief, do we want, corporate logos over that? I would like to have, a cadre of government people that are there to do intelligence that, year to year, that we can count on to give objective, as much as we can hope for, advice and intelligence to our leaders. I mean, I think we've had so many problems with, intelligence being twisted to fit, Cheney's needs and whoever's needs there. When you have people working, I think it adds another dimension of that when you get private sector people doing it. And I think, who do they answer to? And like when you're a contractor, you want to please the person, who gives you the contract. So I think intelligence can be really skewed in that sense. And that's the problem. So I think we really have to figure out, what's okay to outsource and what's not. Lynn?
There was an interesting case that really cuts at the heart of what you were talking about out west. All the national labs are managed by contractors, DOE contracts with Lockheed Martin and University of California, Bechtel, all these large contractors. And at Sandia, there was an employee that was, Sean Carpenter, that was tasked to actually break into Lockheed's computers to see who else was breaking in to actually do games to find it out. And he found out that the Chinese hackers were there, who were hacking into not only Lockheed's computers were okay at Sandia, but they were hacking into computers at NASA, DoD.
The Chinese were.
The Chinese were, the Chinese hackers. And not only, it wasn't classified information, but it was export-controlled information, which meant you had to get a license to export it.
Right.
So Lockheed immediately fired him. And we think the reason was, and he won a trial, he won his case at trial. However, we think that the reason they did that is because China is a big client of Lockheed. And his supervisor said to him, we don't care about these other agencies. We just care about Lockheed. If Sandia's computers are safe, forget everything else. And so he went to the FBI. The FBI had an ongoing investigation into the Chinese hackers and used his information. We're very thankful. But he gets fired by Lockheed because Lockheed wasn't happy that he was giving that information to the FBI. It then comes out that that Lockheed had been fined for illegal transport of technology from the U.S. to China without the proper licenses. So that's like an example of what you're saying is there's no governmental accountability about what's good for the country. It's what's good for Lockheed or the corporation you're talking about.
And the company has its own interest in,
Right.
in
Exactly.
furthering relations with China, and it could be the same. And a different company could have other interests elsewhere that it's worrying about. Yeah, and that's the problem. Is that the reason I want to have government people doing the key intelligence work is I want the person's loyalty to be to the government they serve and us as a public and the nation as a whole, not to their shareholders as a company of a way to make money. And I think that's a problem. Like there was someone from the New York Times. There was a great article about a year ago about just how much outsourcing is going on in the federal government. It's about last June, I think it was, and there was this amazing interview that the Times got with the guy who's the head of the, I forget which agency it is, but it's an agency that has oversight over contracting within the government. And he said, that's what he said very boldly, like you have one entity is loyal to their shareholders, the other entity is loyal to the government of the nation, and sometimes those things conflict. I'm not saying that private spies are unpatriotic or whatever, but they have different motivations and different masters, and that's the problem. So, go ahead.
It seems to me that ever since the Reagan administration, it's almost become a religious mantra in this country that the private sector is always more efficient than the public sector. But if you ask 9 out of 10 people on the street, they would just instinctively answer privatization is always better. And yet, it's ironic that the most widely circulated photocopied comic strip in this country is Dilbert, which does nothing but poke fun at the inefficiencies of the corporate and the private sector. And so it seems to me there's a real cognitive dissonance going on in the minds of the American public. And my question is, how much of this push towards privatization is driven purely by for ideological reasons. That there are sectors of this society that like to privatize everything from the moon to the sidewalks.
Right.
You know, which organizations are behind that, do you see, and where is that push coming from? Leaving alone the issues of efficiency and whatever, but just purely ideologically driven push to privatize.
That's kind of hard to answer because I think, you know, I have this chapter in the book about the history of intelligence outsourcing, kind of a quick history of it, and I talk about how, you know, Reagan started this sort of privatization drive, but it didn't, under Reagan it really didn't go very far because he didn't have much support from, you know, there was a Democratic Congress and there was a lot of opposition to it, and he only, the amount of government entities he actually that were sold under Reagan were very few, but the real push was under Bill Clinton, and you know, Clinton and Gore had this whole initiative called Reinventing Government, is to make government more efficient, and you look underneath that and there was all kinds of outsourcing went on, and particularly in defense. They were outsourcing all kinds of things. They were selling whole entities to private companies. And from his perspective, I guess it was, you know, make government better to serve the people, a sort of efficiency kind of thing. But underneath that was all this outsourcing. And I think, and they kept commissioning. There was like 3 big studies done under Clinton, you know, to okay, what should we do about outsourcing and what's okay to outsource, and they're all run by like Frank Carlucci from the Carlyle Group, or you know, these people like that has a big stake in it, and they're all advising the Clinton administration to move forward on this, and they all have companies that are benefiting from it, you know, and so I think there's a sort of from, you know, Clinton's, I could never quite figure out Clinton's ideology anyway, but if he had one, but so for him it's like efficiency or whatever, you know. But I think on these, you know, Bush, Cheney, it was driven also by this, you know, feeling that it was fine to, you know, outsource the whole, you know, occupation of Iraq, and you know, no problem, these companies will do it really well and so on. But I think you know, you can see the amount of outsourcing just kind of steadily going up from the late mid-1990s. So, and surely it's going to continue. Obviously, you can't just, you know, the governments. Some agencies are trying to employ, you know, hire more government people, and you know, have people within their agencies. The CIA, for example, last year said they put a 10%. They said they want to cut contractors there by 10%, and I think that they're starting to see in the agencies that there's a problem. Even Hayden, Michael Hayden, who's the director of the CIA now, he said something like, you know, we've become the farm team for contractors, and they recognize that it's a problem. You know, I mean, they had to kick a bunch of companies out of the CIA cafeteria because they're like recruiting intelligence officers at lunchtime, you know, and they're in there and say, oh, we'll give you 200,000. You know, you make 100K, we'll give you 200K. That kind of thing, and they had to get rid of these guys, because so it's even begun to tick people off within the government, I think, and I can imagine that. I mean, there was a few people I spoke to who, you know, were kind of, you know, upset about the whole trend. People, longtime intelligence officers, you know, but then there's a lot of people that just say, well, what else can we do? You know, we have to do it, and I think that, I mean, I also think we have to kind of back away and look, you know, what is our intelligence for? What do we use it for? I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I'm not just because something should not be outsourced doesn't mean I approve of, you know, the CIA doing covert actions and trying to overthrow some government. That should be done by the government rather than a private company. You know, it's like it shouldn't be done at all. You know, but do we want to have Lockheed in there trying to overthrow some government? Well, I don't think so. But do we want the CIA doing it? No, we don't. We don't either. So we have to think about, you know, intelligence as, you know, how is it used? And I think that the big issue in terms of oversight and how it's used is the fact that 85% of the intelligence budget is controlled by the Pentagon, and that so much intelligence is integrated with military operations, and they have command and control over the big agencies. And, you know, I think like the imagery agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the stuff they have available is unbelievable. The technology, you know, and mapping, overhead imagery from, you know, U-2s or satellites, and that stuff can be used for so many good things, like tracking refugees, or a situation like Darfur where you can actually see villages that have been razed and destroyed. I mean, that's the kind of intelligence that we need, to see what's going on in places around the world. Not necessarily to, track people traveling around the United States, or tracking people for military purposes. I think so. So in a way, we really, I feel like we really have to evaluate what intelligence is used for. And Bob.
Yeah, I'm wondering in terms of intelligence gathering and analysis, if you have found that the private companies have a particular orientation or particular bias that's different from that of the federal intelligence agencies. Do they tend to exaggerate threats more or less? Are they generally worse at the job than, say, experienced CIA analysts? I mean, does it make a difference in terms of the intelligence product?
Well, I think some of the companies, yes, are different. Like, I have a chapter in here called the pure plays, and the pure plays are companies that it's a Wall Street term for companies that are focused just on one particular industry. That make 70–80% of their revenue from one thing, like Coca-Cola is a pure play because all they do is sell soft drinks. And some of these companies are pure play intelligence companies because that's pretty much all they do. And one of them is the company I talked about, Khaki International. And I have quotes in here from Khaki that'll, it's just their ideological, where they're coming from ideologically is pretty extreme, I think, and that's one company where you really see. I mean, he's just told the language of the neocons of Rumsfeld, preemption is all wrapped up in their language. You read in their reports and annual reports and so on, and so like I would really question with their analysis because they come from this ideological place. Other companies are not so much like that. They tend to focus on what the government needs, or they don't get into like the roots of it so much. But I think the problem is you have to wonder when they write reports for the government about terrorism or terrorist threat in one place or another, how serious, how we should accept that information, since they have a lot to gain from claiming that it's a really serious threat. So I don't really. It's hard to determine how that's playing out. Like I was frankly surprised and happy to see when Admiral McConnell put out that report, the National Intelligence Estimate on Iran, maybe, when was it, 6 or 8 months ago, where they said, Iran stopped making nuclear weapons in 2003, whatever the day was. That was showed that there were, apparently he was giving, at least telling truth to power. It certainly didn't make Dick Cheney very happy. And Dick Cheney's the guy that brought in McConnell. So I don't think I can automatically say, just because they're private, their intelligence is skewed. But I think it really raises a serious question about, other companies and what they do and how skewed intelligence is. And I think we want to be assured that intelligence is not skewed, and that our leaders get the right intelligence so they can make the right decisions. Hope that helps.
Are you aware of other nations outsourcing on this scale?
Well, the U.S. has a really tight relationship with the U.K. in intelligence, and U.K. British companies are very involved, and they've actually outsourced quite a bit there. Some of the big companies over here that are involved in the intelligence market, for example, BAE Systems, which is the U.S. subsidiary of BAE, which is a huge defense contractor. They're very big here in the intelligence market. A company called Kinetic that was spun off from the British Defense Research Organization was privatized, and the Carlyle Group actually bought them 5 years ago or so, and then put a lot of capital into them, and they bought about 6 companies, and they've become a really big player. But other countries are doing it, but nowhere really near the extent that the U.S. and UK. It's pretty much confined here. Although the last couple of days I've been interviewed by Australian radio, and this reporter from Australia was telling me how much outsourcing is going on there. And they're actually asking me about, there's a story that broke on Friday about Carlyle Group, which has been getting out of defense recently. They're buying the government services unit of Booz Allen Hamilton, which is one of the really big intelligence contractors, so they're kind of getting into it. And apparently Booz Allen has major contracts in Australia. But of course Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, it's all part, and the US are all, you know, so they share intelligence. They're very close in intelligence. No other, US has it's only really those English-speaking countries, those that the U.S. has the closest ties with, and that's where I think outsourcing has expanded the most.
So you'd say UK is on a comparable level?
Yeah, I would. Go ahead.
You were saying that the House Intelligence Committee has decided that there really aren't any clear lines.
Yeah.
Are they trying to draw any? Are they trying to, you know,
well, they're
do any
trying
legislation?
Yeah.
Or?
There's a bill up now. Representative David Price of North Carolina, and I forget her first name, but it's Schakowsky from Illinois. Jan, excuse me. Jan. Okay, I'm sorry. They have a joint bill before the House right now that would exclude contractors from interrogations, exclude contractors from being involved in the rendition program, and some other. And they want to have some, you know, firm figures every year from the intelligence community about contracting. And I think David Price, who I interviewed before the book, and I talk about his attempts earlier to do it. I think that bill has a very good chance of passing this year. So at least they're going to create some standards. But it really is, you can find this House Intelligence report from '07 on, you know, on the House Intelligence Committee. It was just, the bill was just never, it was vetoed by Bush, so it never became law. But the language in there is very strong. I mean, they just say, you know, they have no standards for what's inherently governmental and what's not. So clearly some people over there are concerned and want to have, you know, some better idea of what's okay to outsource and what not to. Go ahead.
Do you see, or do you know if the contracts, all these, you know, multitude of contractors have indemnity provisions, like for the telecom companies?
Have indemnity?
Indemnity provisions?
I don't know that. I don't know. They must have some language about that if they're like, you know, well, yeah, or involved in anything that may be potentially illegal. They must have like lots of lines in their contracts about the potential liability and things like that. But it is interesting. Sometimes you can see, like, if you find, in the SEC, of course, they have people, you know, companies have to report to their shareholders about risks, right? And there's always a section about, in contractors, big companies like Booz Allen or any government contractor, about risks. And like I found a couple, you know, just SEC has a pretty good search engine. You can search whole terms, put them in quotation marks. Like I found a lot of people, individuals who were part of intelligence companies, like, you know, George Tenet. You find a company he's a director of, but like they all have language saying, you know, we may, like for a little telecom company, we may be involved in, the National Security Agency may ask us to provide information under a program that may raise liability issues in the future, and they just have to warn their shareholders about it. So I'm sure you know, companies put stuff in their contracts about that very issue, but I've never seen a contract because they're all classified. I don't have a security clearance, and I'll probably never get one, so. Go ahead.
Speaking of that, you were saying that you got a lot of your information because a lot of these companies are publicly traded.
Mm-hmm.
But my impression, without being closely following, is that the movement among contractors is going private so that they can keep their you know, their information and their activities private. Is that the case or not?
Well, if you're privately owned, if you're not publicly traded, you don't have to file with the SEC, and there's a few companies that are. Like, for example, Booz Allen Hamilton is not publicly traded. It used to be, but it's not anymore. SAIC, which is a major contractor, they went public about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. So like they
Clear trend one way or the other.
no, not really. I'd say most of the companies by far are publicly traded. And so that's where you can find out a lot of information. But under Negroponte, when he was the director of national intelligence, he put out sort of guidelines for intelligence contractors where they don't have to spell out the contracts, the specifics of their contract. He gave them a waiver from SEC rules about spelling out the specifics of their contracts. So like, they don't have to say if it's for the CIA or something. So like, I mentioned in the book how these contracts are often the news. If you read a press release, like a company like CACI or Mantech, you read their press release, it's really vague about what they're doing exactly. $130 million to help fight the war on terror. You don't really know, where they're doing it or what. And then, so they don't have to say a whole lot about it. They can be pretty vague. But the thing is, you go to some of these websites, and also I found the most interesting conferences, events I would go to are these places where they do these presentations for investors, and there's a certain kind of hubris that takes over and bravado, and like this one company, they're bragging about how they make this one kind of software, and they had always said in their reports, this company called Mantech, they make a software that intelligence agencies use where people of different levels of classification can get unclassified or semi-classified and classified information on one screen. So if you have a high level classification, you can see your information. If you have a lower level, you can see it and by showing what classification you have. And they had always said that first product they made was for a national security agency, right? A agency. They never spelled it out. But I went to this one conference and the guy said, well, we started out making this for the NSA, and then he went on to say how they sold it to the Defense Intelligence Agency and then somebody else. So actually, he was probably blurting out something that was classified at that session. So there's a certain, sometimes they like to brag, on what they're doing, and you get information that way. But actually, if you go, go on the CACI International website. It's fascinating. You go to their, they have all kinds of stuff on there, and sometimes they put when the guy gives the CEO gives a radio interview, they keep it up there, and they don't think, anyone's going to go on there like I did and actually tape the interview and then transcribe it, But you can he talks in detail, and I quote him in the book, what they're doing with signals intelligence, and I think it gives you a pretty good sense of what they're doing. They're doing what all the agencies do. So. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Someone brought up the subject of the perceived efficiency of private enterprise, and it's obviously not true. If it were, stockholders wouldn't get a hunk of it, and actually be acting in countervalence to the purpose they're hired for. I'm not familiar with the military or the international spying situation, but I am very familiar with the legal field. Investigation. And prisons are all being outsourced.
Right.
And even judges in courts are being outsourced to dispute resolutions by private places. And they're much, much more costly. Besides having to not parole prisoners because the stockholders wouldn't make as much money if there were more people behind bars. Is there any concept that this is costing a hell of a lot in your area? We look at Congress is debating supplemental appropriations to build a bridge in Alaska that goes nowhere. But there's all this going nowhere, being diverted to billions, not just a few hundred thousand. Is there any attention being directed by Congress, I guess, but wherever?
I mean, I think it's just starting, really. I mean, I think that's why some of these Congress people are looking for this legislation passed to get some control over it and get to be able to question intelligence people about, exactly how this is helpful for their agencies.
Well,
Because
isn't it true that someone who is hired under contract to produce intelligence is being paid multiples of what?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's. I was talking to someone about this last night. How it's like usually you think about outsourcing, corporations, even lots of governments, they outsource and because they pay people. They send it to India because it's cheaper, right? Because labor's paid, 10% or whatever American workers. So outsourcing is generally thought of as sort of big cost saving kind of thing, right?
But the profit goes to the stockholders, not to the public.
Well, in terms of intelligence, it's outsourcing costs more. I mean, it's like some of these people get paid double or even triple what they would make at the government, and sometimes they're sitting next to a government person and they're making double or triple what the government person is making. So you have to wonder about that. And then, of course, the corporation has to make its profit, so there's even more money. So the individual might be paid $200,000, and the company might get $100,000 for that person being there. So, you have to wonder about the cost of it. What people in the agencies will say is, or people that support this will say is, well, like at CIA, if you have someone who's a drunk and they're there for 10 years and you have to send them to AA and keep track of them. You can't fire them, right, because they're a government employee. So if there's a contractor that's drunk, they're out the next day. So I suppose that's, one way to, it's easier to fire people. But I think that I don't really see the efficiency savings. I can understand it for highly technical projects and, that the government simply, that isn't inherently governmental. But I can't see it for a lot of the analysis. I mean, I just think this idea of this high-level analysis being done for contracts, by contractors is wrong, and that I quote the woman who wrote the fiction book on this. Her name is R.J. Hillhouse, and she's an interesting writer, and she writes from some expertise. She knows what she's talking about, and I quote her as saying, the president's daily brief should look like a NASCAR car, khaki or Booz Allen or whatever. I mean, it really is lots of corporate input into those kind of things, and I think that high level analysis is what is alarming, as well as their involvement in the domestic surveillance and questionable intelligence practices.
What surveillance is needed, I think, is be easy to figure. Get back to the area, I know, but what it costs to keep a prisoner locked up for a crime domestically, and what it would cost as the state continued to run prisons or the government. And it's right there. It costs much more, and it also happens to be less efficient because of the incentive to keep people behind bars. It wouldn't take 5 minutes to figure that one out.
Getting back to what somebody else asked, in terms of how corporations may sort of make their pitch and whether we should trust that or not. A lot of what they do in terms of analyzing intelligence is, the government wants them to be able to predict crime. Essentially, it's looking at trying to pre-crime. It's that Tom Cruise movie, and they're doing it. I mean, they'll listen to phone calls and they'll try to and we have the best software to track relationships, and they just run these programs as if they're going to be able to predict someone's actions in the future and stop it from happening. And I really look at all look at the lack of real convictions we've had in this country of anybody really for serious terrorist actions. They've tried a lot of people, they've indicted a lot of people, but a lot of times the evidence goes to the court, and the courts many times acquit the people because the evidence just isn't there. And you can't just throw in a bunch of intelligence and say, well, they had 10 calls to these sort of questionable organizations. That doesn't prove anything. And I think that there's too much of that.
They're people incarcerated nevertheless.
Well, there's been people, I'm not saying that, but there's a lot of cases where people, the government's, Ashcroft's gone out there and like there was a case I wrote about in this Salon piece today about this Saudi PhD computer student in Boise, Idaho. And Ashcroft came out and said, this guy is, he's creating internet sites, websites that are aiding terrorism all over and so on and so forth. And they put him in solitary confinement for 17 months and tried him, and a Boise jury just didn't buy it. And they acquitted him on pretty much all the serious charges, and then the government had to drop the rest of the charges, and he left the country. But I mean, there's been a number. There's another case, the Holy Land Foundation, another charity, where they had intelligence and said they were a front for Hamas and they were doing this and that, and a Dallas jury acquitted the top people there. And I just think that the problem is when you get these companies saying, we can predict, our software is going to be able to help you track all these terrorists, and it's just, I think it's data mining, it's called, and I just think it's hocus pocus. I think it doesn't work. I think, if we're going to convict people, go back to the old-fashioned, what's wrong with finding evidence and convicting them. I mean, you want to stop an attack before it comes. But at the same time, I think you want to have a justice system that's just, and I think we're moving in the opposite direction. And I think corporations are helping to fuel that by saying they have the secret to tracking all these terrorists. I mean, you go to one of these intelligence conferences and go see their stuff. I mean, it's just like, that's out of this world, and as you go to Raytheon, huge screen, and they'll say, oh, look, here's these insurgents running around, and see, we can see them, and then there's a little red thing and it's blinking, and they can so how do you know this person is an insurgent, or how do you know this person is this or that? Well, you don't know. They don't know that. They can't get inside the guy's head and see if he's a Sunni Islamic whatever. They can't do that. They can look at people. You can track people very well with incredible detail. But at one of these conferences, I heard General Zinni, who's this Marine Corps general. He was saying you cannot track intent. You can't find. You can't do surveillance and find intent. You can't do that. You can't. We don't have the technology to get inside people's brains yet. I guess they're working on it. So you go to these things and you realize there's a whole lot of software being thrown out there they promise all kinds of things. And then I've heard people like military people who are speak at these conferences. They've just come back from Iraq, service there, and they say just stop throwing this software crap at us. It's useless. Some of them say, forget this electronic mapping. We want to have it on paper so we can go like this, and the old-fashioned technology often works much better than all this fancy stuff. So I think we're also wasting a lot of money on technology that's unproven and not much use, really.
We have time for maybe one last question.
Tim, thank you for this. It's fascinating, and thanks for your research. I guess I wanted to go back to the more political question. And given that it is an election year, do you have any indication? What would you either advise a transition team coming forward, or what would you predict in terms of the remaining candidates? Is it possible to turn the corner and go in a different direction in terms of this intelligence outsourcing? And what would you say to that?
Well, in terms of some kinds of the outsourcing, I heard Obama's military advisor speak a couple months ago, General McPeak, I think his name is. Gordon McPeak. And he just blasted the idea of security contracting. He said it's a disgrace, we shouldn't be doing this, et cetera, et cetera. So he seemed to have very negative feelings about that. On the other hand, one of Obama's top intelligence advisor is a very big in the intelligence contracting community. I'm not sure, you know, how much influence that would have on them, but I'm sure it would have some, you know, and like they're clearly not going to just come in and just say, okay, you know, cut it all out. But McCain, I'm assuming Hillary Clinton is dust now, okay? But as far as the presidential run goes, but McCain has some advisors that are, you know, pretty involved in this, much more involved than Obama. He's advised by James Woolsey, one of his top national security advisors is Woolsey. Woolsey's really into making money on him. I think Woolsey's probably the he should win the world record for best national security capitalist around, because he's really, he makes money from everything he talks about, whether it's, you know, bioterrorism or whatever, you know. He's there. He's making money off of it, and I also think he's a bit of a lunatic, and like McCain is. But you know, it's really hard to gauge how people like that would be influenced by the people around them. I mean, sometimes you take their advice for certain things, you know. But clearly, someone at some point has got to say, okay, let's get a look at this. Let's get some control over it. Anybody who wants, you know, to have a better American national security policy will have to take a look at that, I would think, and hopefully there'll be, you know, that someone will take a hard look at it, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. So,
well, Tim, thank you very much. You've given us a peek inside this book, but there's so much more inside here, and
selling book, John.
This is for sale. Yes. And I highly recommend this book. And as Tim unfortunately pointed out, this is not going to be reversed tomorrow. So we're going to need a map to this new world of intelligence outsourcing. So please buy the book, and please...
And I'll sign it for you.
And Tim will sign it, and please thank Tim for sharing.
Tim Shorrock has written on business and national security for over 20 years. His writing has appeared in several publications, including Mother Jones, Salon, and The Nation. He was also a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Journal of Commerce. For more information,